In this episode, we'll talk about, is it worth our time thinking about God? Is it reasonable believing in God? And in our garden section, we'll talk about covering our soil. Okay, our first question here is it worth my time thinking about God? Well, that's a really good question. I think almost everybody has that question at some point. Whether we start when we're young or as we get older, or maybe someone we knew passed away, or whether we're seeking the truth, or whether we're trying to find out our purpose in the world, or all kinds of different questions. So, why is it important? Well, let's look at some facts that we really know first, and then see if that can help us answer the question. So let's look at the maximum lifespan of a person, 100 years, let's say. Okay, so 100 years. So that's something we know, and then we die. And that's just a fact that we can't avoid, something that everybody knows, okay? So we're going to start with that. Now let's look at how old is the universe? Now, there are different opinions on that, and I'm not going to get into a whole debate on that. So, but let's say the earliest estimate of the universe, I'd say the youngest age would be about 6,000 years old. And there are different people that do believe that, and they'll give their reasons. And then we look at the older age of the universe, and that would be about 13.8 billion years, and people will give their reasons for that too. Now, whether you believe one or the other, that's not the debate here. Either way, that is a very long time. Okay, so we're dealing with a very long time compared to our life. Now, that doesn't mean our lives are unimportant. It just means that our lives are 100 years short compared to the age of the universe to this point. Now let's look ahead into the future. How long do we think the universe will last? And there are different projections there. One theory is that the universe will accelerate and keep accelerating until there's no more energy left, and they call that the big freeze. Another theory is that the universe will expand but slow down, gradually slow down, reach a stop, and then gravity will pull it back and back to the original point. They call that the big crunch. But whether you believe in one or the other, based upon facts or your beliefs, that either one is a long, long time. So at least twice as long as the start of the known universe. So we're looking at an extremely long amount of time. But when we're talking about God, one of the things that we're also going to inevitably think about is heaven. And heaven is eternity, in eternity. So it's kind of hard for us to get our minds around the idea of eternity. But let's take what we know. The age of the universe is a very long time. Now let's imagine a rock the size of the moon made out of solid granite. And every 1,000 years we're allowed to land on it, take a pickaxe, take one swing, take a chunk out, and then leave. And then we'd come back another 1,000 years later, do the same thing. So by the time we were able to whittle the moon down to nothing, that would be the beginning of eternity. So when we look at the age of the universe, eternity is even longer. All right, so let's bring that into context of what it means in this question. So our lives are about 100 years, very short compared to eternity. Here's another way to put it. Imagine you took a ball of string and you walked around your house 100 times. Then on one side of the string, you put a pin. So the string that went around the house several times, that would be the age of the universe, and that tip of the pin would be the age of your life. Now, that doesn't mean your life is not important. It actually means your life is extremely important, and the time that we have is extremely important when we're deciding issues and questions about eternity. Because if we get it wrong in that little time period, we get it wrong for eternity, and we don't want that. So when we look out, is it important to think about God? Yes, simply yes, because we're talking about eternity. And when we look at the whole scope of time, it's certainly worth our time. Now, that doesn't answer all our questions that we have, but our question here was, is it worth my time thinking about God? And yes, if God is in eternity, and that's what people believe, then it's certainly worth our time to think about, because we don't want to get that wrong. So throughout the series, we're going to get into more questions and answers about that. Okay, our next question here is it reasonable to believe that God exists? It's a little different than our other question. And without knowing anything else, let's say we're not taking any other facts into consideration here. We don't know anything. We're just going to look at it from a very simple, logical, reasonable way. And we can break it down into a couple of possibilities. And so let's look at two here. One is, does God exist? The possibilities are yes or no. So that's two possibilities. And if I follow God, yes or no, right? Is it important to follow God? Yes or no? And does God exist? Yes or no? So that leaves us with 4 total possibilities. And let's look at them, each one in a little bit of detail, to see what makes sense, just from a simple logical perspective. Okay, so from our previous question, we looked at eternity, and so if God exists, and the answer is yes to that, then it's very important for us to believe in Him. And if He doesn't exist, well, it doesn't really matter, right? If He doesn't exist, you can do whatever you want, and it doesn't really matter. Okay? So let's look at, first of all, let's look at someone who doesn't believe in God. So someone who doesn't believe in God, we may call them as atheist or agnostic, but the term doesn't really matter. Just someone who doesn't believe in God. So what happens at the end of their life? What do they believe happens? And for some people, they believe that, okay, when you die, there's no God, and your body just decomposes into the ground, and that's the end. That's it. And so of our 4 possibilities, if God does not exist and the atheist is right, then the best case that can happen is that's the end, and it doesn't matter. Now let's look at possibility number 2. Let's say the atheist believes there's no God, and there is God. Now, when they die, what's going to happen? And I can tell you that's not a good situation that we want to be in. It would probably be very awkward facing God, not having believed in Him your whole life and having to explain that. So really not the outcome we would want. So that's pretty bad. So of those 2 possibilities, for a non-believer in God, the best thing that can happen is that they die and deteriorate into the ground. And the worst thing that can happen is they face God and are really could be in a bad situation. All right. Okay, now let's look at for someone who believes in God. Let's look at the first possibility. Let's say God doesn't exist and the person believes in him. So, so that person dies. If God doesn't exist, that person just deteriorates into the ground and nothing happens. Okay, but what happens if that person believes in God and God does exist? Well, then it's a really good outcome. It can be in heaven for eternity. And as we spoke of in another question and answer, that eternity is a very long time. And so if you have made a good decision to be with God in heaven for eternity, that can be really good. So for someone who believes in God, the worst thing that can happen is the best that an atheist could ever hope for. If the believer is right, they have so many more benefits in believing in God. So just taking a look at this just from a simple logical perspective, not believing in God doesn't make a whole lot of sense. There's really no benefit. Where someone who believes in God, the best thing is they could be in heaven with God. So really based upon no other information, no other facts, which we are going to get into more in this series, but just based upon no other information and just the logic of it, it makes a whole lot more sense to believe in God. So going back to our question, is it reasonable to believe God exists? I think we've answered that. Yes, it is reasonable to believe God exists. So it's not just fiction or fairy tales. It is a reasonable argument to be made just on that alone. And then we're going to look at some other questions coming up. Today we're going to look at covering your soil. It's late October in New York. We're in hardiness zone 6 and we expect frost this weekend. Most of the plants in the garden have died back. There's a few left that are still growing, but in the next week or two we expect them to die back as well. We haven't cut down any of the plants yet, and that's okay. Sometimes I don't get to them in the fall, so if you don't and you get to them in spring, that's okay. But the one thing we do want to do to save ourselves a lot of work, maybe double, triple the work for next year, is to really cover our soil with whatever we have. Now, it may be leaves or grass or cardboard, wood, compost, mulch, wood chips, or even tarps. So whatever you have available, you just really want to make sure that you cover all your soil to make sure that the weeds underneath and grass don't get any light. If you do that in the fall, you get a head start for the spring. You know, when the snow comes, it'll cover that, keep it nice and compact. And then when the spring comes, those weeds won't have a chance to sprout up. I mean, you do have to make sure that if you're putting mulch on or leaves or other things, you have to make sure they're thick enough to block out enough of the light. You also have to be careful. If you have perennials, just mark where they are so that you don't completely block those out if you want them to come back. We don't want to put on a thin layer of mulch, especially over grass, because the grass will start coming through and then all your work is really for nothing. You might slow down the grass a little bit, but you don't want to be pulling up individual blades of grass. So if we are going to put down mulch over grass, we definitely want to put like a layer of cardboard first and then a very thick layer of mulch. I would say at least 3 to 4, even 5 or 6 inches the first year. That way you make sure that all the weeds are blocked completely from light. And then in subsequent years you can put on less. If you are using leaves, you can try chopping them up with a leaf blower or lawnmower first, This will help them break down quicker. It may not break down immediately, but even if you put that over the top of your garden like I have here, you'll see underneath every inch you go down, it's further and further looking like soil. Now you can even put down, if you have a compost pile and you have finished compost, yeah, that would be great. Put like 2 or 3 inches at least there over cardboard to block things. That would be a good start. If you don't have finished compost and it's halfway, that can be okay as well. It really depends on what you put in your compost. So I don't put weeds, I don't put seeds, and I don't put any disease. If you really know what you're doing and you can get up to a high enough temperature over a long enough period of time, and you can get all the layers, the outer and inner parts of the compost pile, all completely decomposed and broken down, then you can almost put anything in it. But just to be safe, I don't put any seeds or like weeds or seeds in there unless I know the weeds are just gonna die. Definitely don't put the tough ones in there. And I don't put any disease no matter what, just so it doesn't come back. I don't want to take that chance. If you do apply green grass clippings, make sure that you start out in small layers. You might want to let it dry out a little bit and then put 2 or 3 inches at a time, separated by a brown layer of, wood chips, leaves, anything that's brown. You don't want to put on like a very thick 6 to 12 inch layer of grass, because it will turn into mush. It'll be aerobic and then it could cause other issues. So just use it like a mulch, spread it on, and then just keep adding layers. You definitely want to block out the light. Another thing to note is if you do add wood chips or mulch that's based upon wood chips, only put them on the surface. If you mix them into the soil, it will have a different effect. Since they're not broken down yet, when they're in the soil, it will rob your soil of nitrogen, which we don't want to do. But if it's just on the surface, it'll actually act as like a layer to keep your moisture in your soil, so it'll help, especially on hot summer days. The part that's in contact with the soil, the bugs and worms that are underneath, will gradually break down wood chips that are touching the surface. And then you can pile them up as high as you like. Some people have gone as high as a foot. If you have that many wood chips, that's great, because then you can block out all the weeds, or 99% of them. You can never get to 100%, but most. Another thing you can do is build up layers. So with whatever you have, say you're planting a garden for next year, make it into a rectangle, then you can apply a lasagna layer over it. So you would start out with a layer of cardboard, and then on top of that you can put grass clippings, leaves, mulch, wood chips, even some table scraps. I wouldn't overdo it with table scraps, but you can put some in there. Straw, but you got to make sure you know where it came from, so it doesn't have any pesticides or herbicides in it. I would not add hay, and the reason for that is hay is going to have a lot of seeds, and we don't want to add seeds into our soil. Okay, the purpose of putting the lasagna layer is to block out all the weeds underneath. This is a good approach to use, because if you don't have a lot of time all at once, or you can't do many hours of work at once, you can start out with a small layer, put down a few pieces of cardboard, wet it, put something on top of it, and then you do a little bit of section at a time and just build that up. Key point here is we definitely want to make sure that the grass is blocked before the snow comes. So there you go, you can start building a lasagna layer gradually. This is where it saves you time. If you do have to weed all that out, it's very difficult. I mean, those weeds get rooted in, and you've got to use a lot of energy and force to get them out. So just by covering soil with 3 to 4 inches of something to block it, that makes your life easier. So there you go. Try it out.
God bless.
Thank you for joining us this time, and here is an extra reflection for you.